Just two quick housekeeping program notes. The first is that following our next presentation, we are going to have John Fernandez of Denton's. So you'll note your scorecard that Eva Bruch has already spoken. That will be coming next. Also, maybe good news to some, that the cocktail reception that follows today's proceedings has been moved up to 5:30.
So canceled.
That was the first good executive decision I think I've made in 25 years. But so 5:30 it is. And so without further ado, it is my pleasure, notwithstanding his sometimes snarky questions that are in part directed to me, to introduce a guy who needs no introductions. But with that, Dan, just give me a second. I'm going to pay you a compliment. I wanted to introduce Dean Dan Rodriguez, and I would just say this, that I deal with a lot of law school deans around the country, and I met several around the world, and Dan truly is an educator in the true sense of the word. I knew I liked him when he and I talked, and he said we could do some business, and he really is very passionate both about education and about doing the right thing, and he's also very active in social media, and I think takes great advantage of it. And I really want to tip my cap to him for giving us the green light to do this sort of a thing. So without further ado, and forgive me, Professor Emerson Tiller, who is at Northwestern University Law School, professor of law and business, will have the unenviable job of trying to moderate Dean Rodriguez, but I wish you well, Emerson. And with no further ado, Dean Dan Rodriguez.
Thank you, Mark, for that generous, and let me repeat from the very beginning my thanks and welcoming. I've learned so much in the morning, and look forward to the rest of the activities to come. And thanks for all of you who've come, whether locally in Chicago or from out of town, to be with us. I have my topic title is Legal Education at the Crossroads. I added a bit to it. It wasn't wordy enough. So I did, just to say just a word about the title. I attend, you all attend, and participate, I think, in a lot of conferences involving legal services, and particularly legal technology. And if you're like me, you may find them overly optimistic. They're about this brave new world, about the future and all of that. And I'm an optimist, like Mark is an optimist. But some of my theme here is actually to introduce some cautionary notes, as I say, with an optimistic conclusion, but just to suggest that while many things about legal education are rosy and improving, there remain significant constraints. And when we own those constraints, when we think about those constraints, and apropos of Mark's comment, with which I agree before the break, if we think about them as collaborators with those in the industry and those in the profession, we can really make some substantial progress. So maybe that's a little bit of an opaque theme. So I'm going to quickly go through this, because I hope for the most part what I'm doing here is preaching to the choir, is summarizing, not any great profound insights, but summarizing what we know to be the reasons for the clarion call to law schools to improve, to do things differently, to innovate, and all of that. So this answers, in some sense, in an incomplete way, why bother? Why bother? We've been at this business in legal education for more than 100 years. So the question is, what is broken that deserves some fixing? Changing demands of the marketplace. I'll simply associate by reference everything we know, everything we read, everything we learn, and indeed much of what we learned this morning and we'll learn throughout the rest of this conference. The world is changing, and because we are in the consumer business, we're also in the production business, right? Producing new legal professionals. It behooves us to be responsive as a collective and also as individual law schools to the changing demands of the marketplace. And I mean here marketplace broadly defined. Those who hire lawyers, those who use lawyers, those who even use non-lawyers who are involved in the production of legal services. For those of you who are not Americans, you say, why is he calling us stupid? That, of course, is in reference to either James Carville or Bill Clinton, who said it best in the context of the then presidential election, it's about the economy. And as we think about this as an economic condition, an economic predicament, or economic predicaments, again, that will help drive change and drive innovation. Technology, again, this is, again, incorporating by reference. So this is not, the point is not just simply, we ought to use technology. You'll hear more about this in my presentation and 1,050 other presentations you'll hear about. It's about the impact of technology on our business model and thinking about doing things differently as a result of technological innovation. And it's so banal, it's so prosaic, but it's so essential to remind ourselves as legal educators in our nation's law schools that our students are our clients. So if we talk about, if you, by analogy, if you as lawyers talk about the responsiveness to clients, and clients are driving this bus, they're driving our bus, and the responsiveness to clients, of course, is a key part of this landscape. You will add other bullet points to this list, but I suspect that you will not subtract from this list. This is certainly a key part of our landscape. And we have a number of imperatives, right? Imperatives that we have as a collective of law schools than we have as individual law schools. We have as an imperative the need, the want and the need to provide and inculcate in our students modern skills for a modern world. This is not on the slide, but just as a footnote, as it were, because again, I was reminded by this by the exchange with Mark just before the break. I call this, in some sense, part of this imperative at our law school, and I commend this to anyone else in other law schools, part of law school for life. And that is, it's not just, it's sort of a temporally weird thing that we put our effort as law schools to young people for 3 years, and then they're your problem, your issue, you're embracing. But modern skills for a modern world is not just in the precious 3 years of law school, but it's, or in the context of other countries that don't have the JD, 4 years of their undergraduate legal training. But it also means the skills that we provide as part, law schools, as part of the enterprise in collaboration with law firms and legal organizations to help students and lawyers prosper over the course of their career. We have, as an imperative, I would argue, equally important as this other, is developing and deploying multidisciplinary knowledge for our students. So it's not just a smattering of some business law or business information. It's not just a smattering of technology, a smattering of the humanities. We are truly in a multidisciplinary marketplace, and it behooves law schools, indeed it's imperative for law schools to understand that multidisciplinary challenge. I would suggest that's been true of a long time. So we're just getting knocked over the head with a club on this. But multidisciplinary knowledge, and what I would suggest there should be the increasing de-siloing of legal education and professional education generally, is indeed an imperative, as are the development of technology competencies in law school in different ways. Debate rages happily about whether that means courses in coding, exposure to AI, boutique electives. We'll leave that discussion for another day. It's just to say that an imperative is to provide, at some level of breadth and depth, technology competencies for our students. Nothing unique to this side of the pond. This is true as a universal, I would suggest, with respect to legal education, as it were, at the global crossroads. And we talk a lot about the entrepreneurial mindset, the moving away from the culture, back to culture, of the lawyer as the abominable no man, as the risk allocator, as the one who slows down, right, and tells the entrepreneur you're ahead of your skis. And essentially is in the business sector with an entrepreneurial mindset. That doesn't mean, again, that all lawyers will be entrepreneurs, but again, I was drawn to Mark's remarks at the beginning of this conference that we're in the age of the entrepreneur, so we should be the age of law schools inculcating in our students what is after all, an entrepreneurial mindset. And public service orientation. Doesn't mean all our law students are going to go into the public interest, capital P, capital I, but inculcating in our students the values of public service. All you need to hear about and learn about is the access to justice crisis and the responsibility of lawyers to provide services, not simply to clients, but to the disadvantaged. The use of lawyers for protecting the rule of law, all of that is part of the public service orientation that is imperative to inculcate in our students. So that's the landscape, that's the imperatives. What are some of the deliverables? You will have a different list. Here's my list of sort of some of our responsibility to deliver on these imperatives in law school. We should revisit the first year. That is the holy grail of law schools. You'd be surprised, or maybe not, at the disconnect between legal educators who regard themselves, and I think fairly, as innovators. But when it comes to the first year, they're quick to say, don't touch that. Innovation in law school is about the fabled vast wasteland of the last semester of the third year. Or innovation has to do with some marginal efforts to introduce new courses into the curriculum alongside what is at its core. If you're really going to make innovation in legal education, certainly in the United States, you have to attack or interrogate the holy grail of the first year. You have to, I would say, flip around the notion that the first year is principally about teaching students how to think like a lawyer. It's certainly that, but thinking like a lawyer is thinking like a problem solver, and that should be true whatever courses we require in the first year and in whatever parameters. The learning infrastructure, our curriculum, again, within the first year and beyond. New frontiers of knowledge. That's about not only multidisciplinary knowledge, but it's about teaching our students new things. There are new forms of knowledge that come around every day. We focus, and rightly so, on big data and the impact of big data and technology, but that's not all of it. There are new frontiers of knowledge in the area of neuroscience, which we barely touch in law school, and that's a shame, because neuroscience exists at the fulcrum of a number of unbelievably important developments in the social sciences, in the hard sciences, and yes, even in the humanities. Many of our students thankfully pick up a lot of that in their undergraduate, their graduate education, but it behooves us in law school to think about that as an example of new frontiers of knowledge. Behavioral economics and cognitive psychology I put on that list. It's a long list, but suffice to say that we should be in our graduate school model of legal education, or in many of your countries, the undergraduate model of legal education. In that sense, by the way, you may have a leg up, because you can in fact focus on the nexus between legal education and an overall liberal arts education, and understand the new frontiers of knowledge are key in that regard. Synthetic learning, or cumulative learning, whatever you want to call it, which is the idea that courses exist side by side with one another. So you don't just take your first year courses and you're handed off, as it were, to the rest of the curriculum to do some other stuff. Dabbling is all fine and good, but it's overrated. What is underrated is having cumulative knowledge that builds throughout your course of your legal career. Again, whether it's an undergraduate LLB, it's a graduate JD, the idea that you're accumulating knowledge and information over the course of your time in this precious period of time in which you're in law school is very important, and we have better to do with respect to those deliverables. Now, as someone who studies and writes in the area of public law and administrative regulation, this is perhaps an indulgent remark, but I'd say the administrative state is here to stay. Dark state, light state, I don't care what the hell you call it. I'll just call it the administrative state. The notion that we're moving away from a common law system, which is built primarily on the edifice of case law, and have long been moving away from that in the United States ever since the New Deal, and arguably even before that, and also throughout the world, and certainly in civil law systems, to one in which our students need to be exposed much more to regulation, to statutory lawmaking, and all of that. And as I say, with a tip of the hat to my friends on the far right of the political spectrum, if you don't love it, you still got to live in it. So you might as well better understand it. Technology education through, and here I'll take a page from the wonderful phrase that, to the best of my knowledge, was coined by Deborah Rohde at Stanford Law School in the context of teaching legal ethics. And here I would borrow it to use in the area of technology. And that's the idea that technology education should not just be a course in law tech, although we'll love those courses, but through the pervasive method throughout the curriculum. Different instructors will teach it in different ways, but it should infuse the law curriculum in a much more comprehensive and coherent way, back to synthetic learning, than just, oh, here's a case on legal innovation that we'll get some smart guy to teach as an adjunct. The future is bright and interesting and uncertain, but and I suppose this is a spectrum of optimism and technological knowledge. So at the very least, table stakes include machine learning and AI to understand search and research, perhaps more to understand analysis, perhaps more to understand the role and the utility of expert systems, and if you're Kurzweil and his disciples, maybe to get to a point of singularity. I have no dog in that fight, but I simply say that the more you learn about machine learning and AI, the more you can have that really intelligent discussion to see what the future might hold. And finally, old things become new again, right? Applied knowledge through simulations in the real world, done through clinics, done through externships, done through a variety. So that's a lot of time to dwell on deliverables, but that, of course, is a key part of this, what we're actually doing. A couple more words about deliverables. It's appropriate in the context of a conference like this to talk about the imperative of teaching in our students global competencies. Cultural competencies, structure, by which I mean comparative analysis of how other institutions and legal systems function and operate. This is particularly acute as a need in the United States, where you think we invented law, which we didn't, invented language, which we didn't, and invented structure, which we haven't. So understanding the global competencies at the level of what's going on in the rest of the world is very important. All you need to know is, say more about that. And that's forward focused. It's not just about the way things used to be done, but that the way things are evolving now is a key part of what we should be in the business of doing. Revising our business model. Another discussion for another day, but not to be too opaque about it. Yes, I mean the question of how hellaciously expensive is law school, particularly in the US. Yes, I mean the debate about whether or not law school is too long or too short. Yes, I mean the figuring out what the magic number of law students are. It's basically about not only our educational model, but our business model, and revise it in various ways to understand the modern demands of the marketplace is a key component part of our deliverables. I'm going to come back to this a couple different times. Data, having information, being able to measure change and measuring the impact of change is something about which we have not only tunnel vision, we have a blind spot. We're not good at it in American legal education. We're not fully in on it in American legal education. I'm not sure that they do much better in Europe, in Latin America, in Asia, and elsewhere, but I'd say certainly in the areas that I know most, which is US legal education, we have a lot to learn about the measurement and the analysis of what we're actually doing. Redefining the mission, from educating attorneys to educating legal service providers. We're in this legal service provider business. Yes, we are training individuals, most of whom are going to become licensed attorneys, but that's a means to an end, which is the provision of legal services, and the earliest and the sooner that we get that message across, the better. Diverse cohorts, diverse objectives. Again, not to be mysterious about that, but take a law school like mine. We have a bunch of students who are studying for the JD. We also have a bunch of students, some of whom are in this room, who are studying for a graduate LLM degree. We also have a substantial cohort of students in our newish Master of Science in Law program, many of whom are here in the room, who are studying not to become licensed attorneys at all, but to provide a very important function so they can understand law in a prosper and increasingly diverse environment. And that has a resonance to me in democratizing law. So law schools are no longer simply in the business of just training lawyers, but training folks who are providing services. So again, I'll say the same point. That's my bullet point list. You will have others to add. I hope you'll agree that these are at the very least some of our key deliverables. It's happening. Here's an optimistic rendering. This is not all that radical and new. This is simply as many schools who are doing real innovation that I could fit on this slide. So mea culpa to those schools that are not mentioned. But this gives you, I think, a nice list of law schools that have put their chips into the middle of the pot to say we're going to do some remarkable innovation. It is a list of schools that are diverse, frankly, by prestige level. It is a list that is diverse, certainly, by country. It's also consists of a list, I don't know about you, but some schools that, to be perfectly honest, I hadn't heard much about, if at all, before I really got involved in legal innovation, like Swinburne, like Ryerson University. So, but schools that are really pushing the envelope in some really remarkable ways, and some really old schools. Northwestern is a really old school. We've been doing what we're doing since 1870s, just walk around the building. Stanford Law School is not a new school either, nor is King's College. So it's a variety of schools from a variety of perspectives that are really developing and doing innovation in a substantial way. So that's the good news, right? It's happening and we're making progress. But, yes, there's a but. It's incremental. It's happening slowly. And the improvements and the changes are typically at the margin. It's not revisiting the overall parameters of education. That's perhaps unrealistic, but it's happening incrementally, and for some of us, myself included, way too slowly. It's distributed. I should have said it's maldistributed. It's unequally distributed. The rich are getting richer to some extent. It is, notwithstanding my earlier slide, some of the schools that have the resources to devote to innovation are at the cutting edge. Some schools who happen to have innovative particular members of the faculty or innovative deans for a time are developing these innovations, and it's not anything that's particularly comprehensive, and the distribution should leave us a little concerned since the cohort, as it were, of the next generation of lawyers, our cohorts are going to come from, in the United States, 200 different law schools. In China, 600 different law schools, and throughout the rest of the world, a lot of schools. It's not moving the needle. And here I want to make a controversial point, but a point I hope you'll appreciate. Development of innovative deliverables is not, by and large, at least thus far, moving the needle on employment. So it hasn't increased the demand for lawyers. And I'll make a deeper point, which is there's not all that much evidence available that the schools that are, let me call them down the pecking order list from the traditional criteria, which I'm not here to defend, on the contrary, I think it's a silly pecking order, but schools that are down the list of the pecking order of law schools are not finding law firms, the big law firms, tripping over one another to hire them. It's moving the needle somewhat, but the jury's still out about whether schools can basically say, we're not going to be Harvard, we're not going to be Stanford, but instead we're going to be the school that's going to slip right in and be the lean, agile school, and the firms will beat a path to our doorstep. Hasn't yet happened at least in the US, and I would fathom it hasn't happened much in the UK, and it hasn't happened in a lot of other countries, and that's too damn bad. It hasn't moved the needle on rankings. We haven't seen a skyrocketing effect of law schools that have done innovation in moving the needle on rankings. Many of you would say too soon to tell, fair enough, but at least not yet. It's not moved the needle substantially in terms of economics. Schools have not rescued themselves, as it were, from their economic predicaments. It hasn't arrested the decline until fairly recently of law school applications. I mean, we've seen a bump in the last, this past year in law school applications in the United States. It's not called the AI bump. It's not called the innovation bump. It's called the Trump bump, right? So it reflects something that's highly, very different than the kind of things we're talking about here. And that's just my point. It hasn't moved the needle yet on law school demand. And again, I said this again, I'll say it again in this presentation, it's poorly measured. We don't know what the connection has been, the impact of serious law school innovation and things that where we can say this is successful for these particular reasons. I want to say a word about constraints versus conditions, to use a bit of vernacular. And I take this from the literature on games, of all places. They draw a distinction, those who study games in a serious focused way, between conditions and constraints. Constraint is a rule that applies throughout a game mode. A constraint enables or restricts play in certain ways, but it does, and it does so universally and usually without variation. By contrast, a condition are rules which are triggered by player actions. So I want to use that as a piece of vernacular. You may quibble with that, but bear with me. Let's draw a distinction between constraints and conditions so I can talk in the remaining time I have about which are constraints that we basically should accept as universal and which are conditions. Or if you prefer your wisdom from IBM, it's a much longer and verbose, who'd have thunk it from IBM, way of expressing essentially that point. I'm bored already from this slide, so I'm not even going to get time to read all that. Goethe. Let's talk about that great poet and humanist Goethe. Some of you may know started out as a lawyer. Actually studied law at Leipzig in Germany. Got bored with that. I had this wonderful quote from Wikipedia. I'm sorry, from a very important source that I used to research Goethe. It said he studied law, but he was bored by the universal fixed laws of jurisprudence, so he took up poetry and the humanities, and thank God for the world he did, right? Rather than stayed as a small-time lawyer. By the way, if you get a chance to walk around Chicago in the area, there's a street, but they pronounce it Goethe. So what can I tell you about ugly Americans? But Goethe taught us about iron laws from On the Divine. I'm not going to read it in German, you'll be happy to know. As great eternal iron laws dictate, we all must complete the cycles of our existence. So, to get to the point, what are some of those iron laws, fixed things that will not be changed by innovation in law school models and curriculum? One is the problem of scarcity, the basic economic condition. Law schools don't have, as I was reflected in my very snarky comment before the break, law schools do not have the capacity to be all things to all people and to do everything. They are faced by scarcity considerations, and all the way down. Our students face scarcity conditions in terms of how much they'll pay. So you say to a student, we have a wonderfully innovative law school, it'll cost you 200 grand to go to a year. Thanks, but no thanks. So law schools face, as all educational institutions face, the fundamental economic condition of scarcity. And innovation does not move that needle. It also, we have the constraint of collective action, the ability of us to cooperate. Of course we know that it would be a better world if law schools could collectively engage in these kinds of reforms. But that's nearly impossible to imagine that could truly happen. I don't mean the collaboration is impossible, but I just mean the collective action principle exists as a powerful constraint about the ability of educational institutions to do that. And related to that is the point about competition. Now, some might quibble with this, quarrel that this is a constraint. Can't we all basically unilaterally disarm and not be competitive? Well, good luck with that. We're in an extremely competitive environment. I just want to sort of set that out there and put those aside as constraints on innovation that we have to work around. The more interesting point is about conditions, things that we actually are important limitations on innovation. But this is really the principal point of my presentation that we need to attend to if we're going to make substantial progress and headway on innovation in legal education in our country and in other countries. Here's my top 10 list in no particular order. One is the fact of the degree. It's quite puzzling. Both the JD and the LLB are imperfect degree models for legal education. The weight of the JD sits over us as 3 big, expensive years, right? That's hard to fathom exactly what it contributes. And with apologies to whoever said that the unbearable lightness of the LLB is sort of inadequate. We don't have a Goldilocks scheme yet for figuring out what's the appropriate degree that really channels and incorporates innovation and then takes that innovation and deploys it for the benefit. Maybe it's a 2-year JD, maybe it's a 3+3, maybe it's maybe the Brits are onto something by basically saying an undergraduate degree that doesn't necessarily have to be around law. But experimentation is fascinating. I'll simply say that the condition of the degrees, the JD on the one hand and the LLB on the other, impose some conditions, that not constraints, because these are malleable, conditions on innovation. The schedule, it's a puzzle. Here in the US and Europe, just think about this. We've had the semester system that's been around for about 150 years. What is the magic about teaching contract law for 15 weeks? Not for 5 weeks, not for 35 weeks, not in a flipped classroom format where you do most of your reading on the outside. What did our forefathers know in 1890 that was so beautiful that in 2018 we basically had the same damn schedule as existed 120 years ago? Riddle me that, Batman. So figuring out how the schedule imposed, yeah, there's schools with quarter systems, yeah, there's some executive education, although not that many. Yes, it's done differently in some countries, but we still have the millstone around our neck of how we deal with the academic calendar. The pedagogy. Could say a lot about that. I'll say a little, which is just how we teach, how I'm teaching now, how we teach in the traditional classroom, the reliance on existing extant models of the human standing before, and like the proverbial, Socrates teaching to I guess he taught to one, right? But the proverbial whoever teaching to a wide group, the kind of the pedagogy is arresting and remarkably thin gruel for an innovative environment. I go on. The university imposes some significant constraints, profound constraints on innovation. Lack of incentives for interdisciplinary work, highly centralized, bureaucratic and administratively driven. And I'm not just talking about the central leadership of the university. I'll tell you a quick anecdote because I can afford to do that because I'm leaving and she's leaving. The dean of the business school called me a few years ago excoriating me about the fact that we were developing this Master of Science in Law program, which was fundamentally about law and business technology, insisting to me that we had no business teaching business in the law school. Yeah. right? That basically business was for business schools to teach. And to be fair, I'm not sure how thrilled I would have been growing up in a university setting if my colleagues in engineering decided to have a law degree. But we got to get out of our tunnel vision and understand the modern university imposes very significant and severe constraints on the ability of law schools to innovate, not just in the US, but throughout the world. Now I'm going to say something unpopular about, that is unpopular in an audience of lawyers and law professors about accreditation. And what I'm going to say unpopular about it is, it ain't as much of a condition and a limit on innovation as it's made out to be. There are some parts, and I'm here speaking in particular about US law school accreditation through the Council of Legal Education, imposes some constraints on innovation. Some of the most serious constraints that are likely to remain for the foreseeable future are nagging, and I think, if I may, anachronistic. That law school has to be 3 years. That you have to have, 83 credits? See, you're impressed I remember that, Barry. 83 credits, that you have to, there's limits on. So we could quarrel and quibble about certain accreditation standards. Those are profound constraints, as are some constraints on who may teach. That's the debate about adjuncts or full-time faculty. But even that, schools manage to work around. So let's give credit where credit's due. The accreditation standards have been modernized in a particular way. We do have the capacity of law schools to engage in distance education. We do have the ability of law schools to engage in multidisciplinary education. There is an amount of creativity. The testing requirement, hopefully in a couple weeks' time, will disappear. And even that as a constraint on law school education is likely to wither away. I'm less worried about accreditation at the level of the ABA, and much more worried about accreditation restraints at the level of state bars in a very balkanized system, which threaten to limit innovation in a very important way. Other countries have different accreditation standards. I'll simply say that accreditation, to me, reflects not a constraint, but a condition on innovation. I'm running out of time, so let me get through some of this stuff. Credentialing. Again, the teaching to the bar. The notion that we are required the legal education to be built around preparing our students to take a bar exam is becoming increasingly anachronistic. Because take my word for it, and you don't have to take my word for it, because probably 98% of you in the room have had this experience. The bar exam is, wait for it, not basically a big innovative test, right? Last time I checked, which was a while ago to be sure. So there is a puzzle or paradox with respect to credentialing. Faculty expertise, we talk all about, I'd love to teach a lot more of machine learning. But I'm probably in the top 3 of on my faculty with expertise in machine learning, and that's sad and pathetic state of the world. So you're supposed to laugh at that. That was self-effacing. That was a self-effacing comment. So there's a lack of faculty expertise in terms of developing the kind of competencies that you would really, and the incentives for hiring faculty to do that. I'll run through the last 3 quickly. Technology, by which I mean limits on the access to technology that's available. Even if Andrew Arruda wasn't here, I hope I would say the same thing, which is you should recognize that Ross's making available EVA to law schools for the incredibly low price of free is a game changer. If 15 or 35 other tech companies would make that same essential deal with their particular products, that could be a radical change. Even if they did it for strong economic, profit-motivated reasons, that's still enormously beneficial, but we don't have that. And so because we don't have that, our law schools don't have access to some of the modern developments of technology, and that's a problem. Balkanization, 50 state bars, different, in Europe, different credentialing requirements in different countries, same in Latin America, that's a problem, and information asymmetries probably speaks for itself. I'm winding down. Perils, if we don't change. That's the point of this. Perils if we don't change. Like the song says. Going to get bad, continue to get bad. Rust truly never sleeps. So the difficulties are going to plague us in the absence of, it's not like there's a pause button until law schools figure out whether they're going to adapt. This is a paradoxical one. Insularity is a contagion. You think of contagion as when you get out in the world and inflict disease on people. The insularity within schools becomes contagious. It becomes different to get out from under with respect to innovation in law schools. This will date you. Anybody know this reference?
Sure. The Beatles.
The Beatles, Day in the Life. I read the news today, oh boy. It comes John Lennon's reading a newspaper in the Daily Mail, and he sees this story about 4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire, which are reference to potholes in the London streets. Said somebody took months and months and months and issued this massive report saying there were 4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire. And he goes on to say, and though the holes were rather small, they had to count them all. The moral of the story is, as the Daily Mail said the next day, they spent all their money in counting the holes in Blackburn, Lancashire. They didn't have enough money left to actually do anything about it. Kind of makes you think, it's deep. Huh? So we can study and study and study without making real innovation in a particular way. The next line, by the way, which has to do with Albert Hall, as best I'm concerned, was totally made up from another reference because they were probably smoking a lot of weed when they were. So what are some of the solutions? Blue sky thinking. Really thinking outside the box, how we can get to reform. Natural experiments, that's a lot to want, but seeing how schools do it and evaluating those kinds of changes. Public-private partnerships to really get a development about how we might really tackle some of these issues. And global networks, exactly what we're doing here. Exactly what we're doing here is learning from folks throughout the world and developing these sorts of best practices. It's about the data. It's about the data. It's about the data. We have very little, but progress is being made. There's this wonderful site that comes from Stanford, has a very nice set of drop downs that really give you a nice précis about what's going on in the space. It changes every day or every week, but it's still a nice summary of what's going on in the legal innovation space. Dan Linna is in my earshot. I can't figure, where do I hit the button to do this? Because I know I'm running out of time, but I definitely want to do this because Dan's here and he'd be mad if I do that. If you haven't seen it, you're missing out on a lot, which is Dan's prototype for law school innovation. I just want to make the point, I want to dwell on the particulars of this, but that's about developing data. That's about actually helping us understand what law schools are doing to innovate. That's progress, and I hope that prototype turns out to continue, as I know it will, under his leadership, to really give us some wonderful data about law schools, not only in the US, but worldwide. Credit, why am I want to get to the next slide.
You gotta switch back to PowerPoint.
Did you say top 3, Dan?
Top 3.
He did it.
I'm not going to do this link because we're out of time and I get in trouble. And Lauren's about 12 months pregnant, so I don't want her to walk up here again. Oh, sorry, I gave away your secret. But the AALS collects, to their credit, never did until a few years ago. If you want to see a 1930s technology, look at the AALS website 4 years ago. But now it's new and improved AALS, and they actually collect information about innovative programs and faculty. Harvard Center, again, I won't open the link. The Harvard Law School Center on the Legal Profession collects this data. That's the point. We're starting to get a collection of data, and that's great. And I end with Goethe. How not to. Daring ideas are like chessmen move forward. They may be beaten, but they may start a winning game. And I love that. That's it.
Thanks, Dan. Is that on?
Yeah.
I wrote my questions. So that right, you set me up there on my technology device. See, things are changing around here.
So I said I'm in the top 3, so I got number 1 and number 2 elsewhere in the room, and Emerson.
Great, thank you for that. So I just have a couple questions or things to add, and they might be the same question I asked, but I think each one might open up an opportunity for you to expound on some of the points that you made. So my overall idea here was what you're talking about in this presentation is the renovation of the modern law school, but it presupposes the law school as the dominant educational structure of law. And so my 2 questions, again, they could be the same question, I'm not sure. One, are law schools being artificially sustained, not necessarily held back, but artificially sustained by state bar and ABA regulation, university property rights, in that engineering school you can do that, business school you can do that, law school you can do that. or maybe a more general embedded reticence to change within the world of law. So this is about why does it have to be law school? And then the second question, which I think maybe just takes us a little deeper, is who or what is the future competition to the law school as an educational institution? Law firms who may have strategic and maybe even more efficient training opportunities due to technology and the breaking down of ABA and state bar regulation. Engineering and business schools who may be adept at capturing what I would call the growth areas of law related education, much like we've done with our MSL. We were a bit in front of the ball and maybe stole some things from maybe Kellogg that they could have done. They could have had a concentration in legal practice management. Or the engineering school could have a master's of computer legal design. And when that emerges, will we be capturing it or will they? Okay, what, why us? Is that, should we presuppose that it's us? Silicon Valley startups who may even make the training of much of lawyering irrelevant because it will be robots doing it, not necessarily the training, but the actual practice itself. So I guess what I'm asking, is it necessary that we continue as a law school to be valuable and relevant in the future of legal education or law itself?
A lot there. So to circle back to the first, the answer is yes. Clearly yes, is that the law school hegemony, let me focus on the US, which I know more about, and broaden outward, where I know less about. Certainly in the United States, we are being propped up by the requirement that exists on the part of the state bars that you have a JD degree in all but one, you have a JD degree in order to sit before the bars, say all but one. Wisconsin has a diploma privilege for years and years and years. At all these conferences, they say that's anomalous. There'll be other states that'll do that, but so far, 49 of the 50 states require you that you have a JD in order to sit for the bar. There's some, if we had longer time, there's put a caveat. There's the whatever apprenticeship, but by and large, it's that requirement. For those of you from outside the United States may not know this. That's not an ABA requirement. There's no requirement that the states that the ABA couldn't require the states to say you have to have a law degree from an ABA accredited law school. That's simply been what the states actually decree. But so long as the states decree that, that means that law schools that operate under the business model and the educational model established by ABA accreditation standards will be propped up in just that way. Having said that, like all forms of regulation, that can become destabilized. Surprising that we haven't seen more of competition among the states, perhaps to incentivize schools to do other things. Maybe California is out there and has long been out there more than others, because actually there are a number of non-ABA accredited law schools in the state of California that serve the function of setting them out there. But it's a long way to come to the point, which is, yes, we're artificially propped up. I didn't mention this at all in the presentation. We're also, in the US, artificially propped up by the availability of highly federally subsidized loans for legal education, something that's in an enormous amount of turbulence. And if and when, he said when, I can't believe he went there. If and when that is removed, will affect legal education, business model, legal education in some profound ways. So I hope that addresses that, which is, yes, we have some artificial constraints. The point about university property rights I want to think a little bit more about, but I'm tempted to say yes to that as well. There's a lot of things that are establishing that law school hegemony. To get to the second question, two things I want to say about that. Number one is, we don't have some, in terms of this point about, are law schools protected in some way from other departments, other schools, other service providers like law firms to basically do a better version of what we do. Number one I want to say is, take apart the artificial part, the first question. We are not intrinsically better at that. I think we are better at that. We have the incentive to do so and the expertise to do better than DLA Piper does to provide a full-fledged legal education. I watch with interest the SRA's developments in this regard, but I'm skeptical on a number of dimensions, empirical and not empirical, about whether you're going to see a burst of a ton of solicitors educated that is not with a law degree, with an LLB. They're going to flood the market to practice law. You'll see some, and I applaud the innovation, but I think if law schools went out of business tomorrow, or there were 20 law schools rather than 200 law schools in the United States, I don't think the DLA Piper or the Kirkland and Ellis Law School would be anything that we would say, oh, that's sort of better than what Stanford or Northwestern does in some particular way. The university point that you raise, Emerson, is to me a different story. And whether you're talking about an innovative program like a Master of Science degree or some combination of program like a JD MBA or something where you're really drilling down and helping to get students to learn a multidisciplinary skills, practical skills, technology skills, and the like, I agree with you absolutely 100% that there's no intrinsic reason to believe that law schools are better at that. And indeed, if some departments and some well-resourced institutions like, say, business schools, public policy schools, maybe engineering schools, flush and rich because of endless supply of computer science undergrads, actually got in the business of doing some law and training, that competition would be serious and severe, which brings me to a normative point, a controversial normative point. To me, that's okay. We face that competition, we ought to face that competition. We should compete on a level playing field. If our colleagues in the Kellogg School of Management, in cooperation with the McCormick School of Engineering, could come up with a better version of a law program for STEM-based professionals, then more power to them. If Chicago Kent, to use an example of an institution across town, which is part of, as you know, the Illinois Institute of Technology, why the heck the Illinois Institute of Technology doesn't get together with all their leadership, seeing how successful Northwestern's program is, and by the way, it's been hugely successful, economically, pedagogically, whatever. Why they're not sitting there right now as we speak, organizing themselves to have a master's program that brings together all the component parts of that university, including a terrific law school, beats the hell out of me. And I think that's true of a lot of institutions that could. MIT could develop presumably a first-rate program that builds, even without the law school, in some narrow areas. Whether it would be a full-service law school is a different story, but Emerson, I took your question to be not just at the level of would we face competition to have a full-blown law school, but would we face competition in segments of what we do, such that it would really come down to how great are law schools and law school faculties at competing with great engineering schools, business schools, medical schools, and the like in providing these kinds of services. And I've gone on a while, but if you'll permit me 60 more seconds. We should also make that point about international institutions. Why the hegemony, other than the fact it's artificially propped up, of American law schools teaching students to practice American law? If Ryerson, as an experiment, a really interesting experiment in Canada, really takes off, why should they limit, within their bandwidth, their focal point to just teaching students Canadian law? As I understand Ryerson's educational model and mission, it is a global mission that has resonance that is trans-Canadian. So if I'm the master of Ryerson, I'd say my business plan for the next 20 years, not for the next 2 years, for the next 20 years, is thinking about creating a truly global law school. I don't mean a couple of conferences about global law. I don't mean a couple of faculty members who have comparative interests. I mean creating a truly global law school. I would particularly do that in Canada, which is less encrusted with some of the regulatory constraints that the US has. So that's another answer to that. And if they did that, we'd face some serious competition in American legal education from a law school or institution right on their doorstep. And I'll say, footnote on a footnote, there are some other countries that are starting to experiment with that too. Melbourne has a JD. Wasn't always true. First-rate university in Australia. Australian universities are cleaning the clock of American law schools in terms of LLM programs in recent years. The London School of Economics actually has a much more elaborate online version of graduate education than anything the US has come up with in the last 50 years. So we're facing international competition in an extraordinary way.
Okay, so I think given our time constraint, I should allow some other questions to come up from the audience. So we'll start
I'll
right
keep my answers shorter, promise.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that there's great demand for the sort of innovation that we're talking about. At the University of Arizona, just 2 years ago, we launched a BA in law. We have 700 students pursuing that degree now, and it's interdisciplinary. We offer classes. It's in the business school, public
I remember the conference when Mark Miller stood up and talked about the BA in law, and the folks that didn't walk out of the room to get coffee or take a break were laughing. And now they have 700 students. By the way, he also talked about his China program that people were laughing at too.
We now have 5 micro campuses,
Right.
not just in China, so.
So, just goes to show. People don't leave the room when Mark talks as much anymore, yeah.
On the delivery of education, like Sony California, who's doing more like online JD program even. So this is another area which will be more cost effective, but the rest of the US is not doing it.
Well, Barry Currier's in the room, and he knows more about, in 5 minutes, about online JD programs than I'll ever learn in a lifetime. So I don't have much to contribute to that. I'll simply say 2 quick things about it. One is the excuse that law schools have typically had, which is the ABA would never permit it, is starting to wither away. And so now the question is whether law schools have the resolve and interest and see the value in moving toward an online education. I don't mean that it's a free form, but there's much more regulatory innovation possible. But number 2, you're absolutely right. As a descriptive matter, we haven't seen an enormous number of schools run into that space. William Mitchell and Syracuse are the 2 law schools that, to the best of my knowledge, of traditional law schools, they're the furthest along in developing online JD programs. But again, I don't have access to all the knowledge and the collective action problem. Again, for all I know, there's 15 schools experimenting as we speak with those kinds of initiatives.
Yes.
You very briefly touched on rankings and them not being affected by innovation or programs of innovation so far. I was wondering if the rankings you're talking about, I don't know if it's US News or whether
That's really all I was talking about.
Okay, do they have subcategories of innovation?
Nope.
If they don't,
None.
it would be a good idea for schools that find innovation important to maybe lobby US News and say.
Your lips to Bob Morse's ears. There's one man in the United States, I understand he's retiring, but up till now there's one man in the United States who truly is the czar of rankings. It ain't any of the law deans, it's not Barry Currier, it's no one else other than Mr. Robert Morse, who could, with the stroke of a pen, include a measure of innovation in US News. To the best of my knowledge, it's pie in the sky.
Yeah, because it could move the needle if schools that find it important start getting ranked on it, others will see it, and so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
maybe it's in there.
Absolutely.
Yes.
I was interested when you said one of the conditions was faculty expertise. As a former associate dean, I was kind of surprised with faculty interest because.
Faculty interest?
Interest, yes, because I have deep faculty who want to innovate anything when they represent 90% of my budget. So it was almost like having to produce a separate little school to try something out. Do you get that, Rob?
I was trying to, I love my faculty. Are there any here? I wouldn't say anything I'm about to rejoin them. I was trying to be scrupulously neutral, but of course I didn't succeed in saying faculty expertise. You're quite right to say, well, it's not just faculty expertise, it's the absence of expertise born from a lack of interest, and structurally the lack of great interest on the part of faculty to hire other faculty to join them that have greater expertise. I don't want to exaggerate that because that would minimize the important contributions that new kinds of faculty members are making in our law schools in the US and abroad. But I couldn't agree more with your point, which is you face this stumbling block that's not unique to legal education, that's about education generally, which is we tend to replicate ourselves.
One last question.
Yep.
Dan, this is not the first time technology changes, right? So lawyers have experienced technological changes in the past. What is it about this change right now that makes these questions this important?
So I'm not the best person to answer that question because I'm neither in a law firm nor am I a technologist. That said, let me say 2 quick things. My understanding is the technology is changing more rapidly than the past. This is not just Moore's Law. I get that point about Moore's Law, but it's something deeper and broader than that in terms of the pattern of technological change and the imagination. And here I'm going to drink, I haven't drunk the Kool-Aid, I'm going to commend it to you. That is what I understand to be, for example, the potential contributions of machine learning to not only help us in important ways with legal search and research, but actually to help us interrogate the conceptual foundations of what it means to think like a lawyer and use substantive expertise. Even if those predictions are only 60% correct, that is destabilizing in a way that the rise of personal computing, the development of other technological movements in the past really didn't do. And of course, smarter, more sophisticated people have written about that better than I could, number one. Number two, what's different about it is firms have woken up to the demands and the utility of that technology in a way that was different before. In the olden days, it was academics would say, hey, this new revolution's coming, it's really interesting, there's all these new things happening. And some educational institutions would say, yeah, we should really get on that. And then you'd ask a managing partner at a law firm and they'd say, oh, that's really cute. The law school's doing some stuff in that area. Not so much anymore. So the synthesis between what the law schools are demanding in terms of technological sophistication on the part of young lawyers and what the law firms are demanding and what law schools have the potential to develop strikes me as reflecting some different changes in some particular ways. Just one quick, I know we're out of time, one quick anecdote that involves legal search I've been thinking about lately. Everyone draws, a lot of folks are drawing an analogy between the kind of search engines that you find in Ross products or Casetext and others and say, that's just like Lexis and Westlaw 30 years ago. Lexis and Westlaw's integration and penetration into law schools and law firms was very, very different. Those were two very different marketplaces. And the development of the evolution of legal search in the law firm, as I hope I'll write about in a longer form, in law firms and law schools were quite different. What's going on now, as best I can see, in terms of the energy in the legal search area generated by AI and machine learning brings much more closely in contact what the law firms need and want and what the law schools need and want. That is potentially disruptive and destabilizing in a happy way that's very, very different than the good old days, if you want to call them good old days, when all of a sudden, first Lexis and then Westlaw developed their search capacities. So I got Mark Cohen in my peripheral vision, so maybe we could have more discussion about this at another time.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Dan.
Dan.